everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today, I'm honoured to be speaking with Tom Young. Tom, welcome to the Sports Psych Show.
Hi Dan, good to be here.
Great to have you on, mate. Really excited to be talking with you today. Why don't we get cracking by you introducing yourself to the Sports Psych Show audience?
Yeah, no problem. So, I'm Tom Young. I'm a sports psychologist. Kind of studied at Lancaster initially, doing undergrad there, and then moved on to John Moores, where I did my master's and my stage 2. And from there, I kind of started to work in business consultancy, and then starting to work in applied sport as well. And probably, for anyone who's interested in terms of specific sports, probably predominantly golf and football, as well as them working with various individuals. But always had a real interest in kind of leadership and culture. And that's where the book kind of really came about, really.
When you say the book, that's what we're going to talk about today. You've released a book this year in 2020. It's called The Making of a Leader, What Elite Sport Can Teach Us About Leadership Management and Performance. And I've been reading it this week, mate. It's a serious book. I loved it. I really enjoyed it. It must have taken you some time to write. Tell me a little bit about where this came from, this book.
Yeah, it has taken me a while to write. It's probably taken me 4 years or something like that. I mean, and you can see when you read it, obviously the timeline of some of the interviews where they've, with a couple of people, we did 2 interviews. So Stuart Lancaster being one of those, and Roberto Martinez. Both of those so with Roberto interviewed him while he was at Everton, and then again following the World Cup in 2018. But it actually started at Liverpool John Moores as this piece of research that, you know, when you have to do your stage 2 and you need to do this, almost a dissertation again, really. And going through that process, I'd kind of put that off. I was working at the time, and I was going through that process, and I really wanted to do something on the research side that I didn't want to just do something to tick a box and get the qualification. I wanted to do something that was really of interest to me. And I've always been fascinated by the kind of the cultural side and the leadership element of that. So I set about trying to source some interviews, and just trying to get in touch with people and asking people to make referrals to try and set these up. And it went from there. And actually, I wrote the piece of research. And as you do when you're doing a piece of research, it's anonymous. So it's participant A, participant B, says this, says that. And these interviews were, these people that I've interviewed have spent probably on average a good couple of hours with me, each of them. And then from there, it was actually Stuart Lancaster who read it and said, well, I've read a lot of books actually on this area, and you've probably got the makings of one here. So the book was not a result, or is not the result, of a master plan to bring a book out. It just kind of evolved, as many things do. And from there, from that conversation, it kind of lit a bit of a fire for me. And then the process was, so it wasn't writing a book from scratch. It was taking a manuscript, an academic manuscript, and trying to make it accessible to a wider audience. And that piece has then took another couple of years, I suppose. So it has been a long slog, but it's been worth it. I've enjoyed the process. I've enjoyed learning about how that works. I always wanted to write. I always enjoyed writing. I kind of wanted to be a sports journalist before being a sports psychologist. So I've kind of combined that now, and really happy with how it's come out.
Well, I can assure you've done an awesome job translating the academic research into practical application. And just a couple of things before we crack on dissecting your book. I mean, you mentioned Stuart Lancaster there, who is one of the leaders that you speak to, just so everybody knows that I've interviewed Stuart Lancaster for the Sports Psych Show before. He's on episode 88. And you also mentioned stage 2. And I know there'll be some coaches listening going, what is stage 2? What are you talking about? But that's the supervision that you have to go through to become a sports psychologist.
Yeah, and obviously you've got two routes, I think, or when I did it, you've got your BASIS route if you've done sports science at undergrad, and then because I'd done psychology at Lancaster, I went down the BPS route, the British Psychological Society, and they call it stage 2. It's quite a strange name in that sense, isn't it? And I think there are other options now. But effectively, rather than me choosing a PhD or something like that, I went down this route that allowed me to work, to practice, and kind of to learn on the job, I suppose. So yeah, I did that at John Moores as well, and the piece of research was a requirement of that.
Great stuff. Well, The Making of a Leader, your book. Now, you interviewed, let's have a look, 2, 4, 6, 7
Yeah.
leaders. Michael Maguire
Hmm.
from the World of Rugby League, who coaches Wests, Tigers, and New Zealand Rugby League. Stuart Lancaster, as we said, who's at Leinster Rugby, formerly with England Rugby. Gary Kirsten, South African cricket. Roberto Martinez, now coaching the world number 1 team, Belgium. Ashley Giles, who is now he's from cricket and he's director of cricket at the English Cricket
Yeah.
Board, the ECB. Dan Quinn from the Atlanta Falcons in the NFL, and Sean Dyche at Burnley Football Club in the Premier League.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah.
um, 2, 4, 6, 7 leaders. That must have taken you some time to get them on board.
Yeah, I think, and especially when you approach these people. So Sean Dyche and Dan Quinn came after the academic piece. But if you think about the other 5, you've already approached them to do an academic study, and then you're saying, can I do a book as well? Like, are you okay with it being a book? And obviously that's a different request because it's named. It's a commercial venture to a certain extent. And they were great with it. So it was more pinning them down in terms of time. Once you had them, they were great. They were really generous with their time. And then it was also just wanting to dig a little bit deeper on certain aspects. So being able to revisit it and just send them a quick email or ask them to send a quick voice note on WhatsApp answering one question in a little bit more detail, for instance. So the logistics of it were a little bit difficult. And getting their permissions was actually quite easy.
Okay.
I think, and that's really interesting. I think in the past, maybe people have been a bit guarded. We don't want to share what we do within leadership in general. And now, I felt there was a real kind of hunger to do that. So not just they were okay with it, they were actually really happy to do that and to kind of talk quite openly about how they approach these things. So once you had them, and once they'd given that permission, I suppose, they were all brilliant with their time and with their insights. And as you'll see from reading it, so you mentioned Michael Maguire at West Tigers. Well, when he did the interview, he was at South Sydney Rabbitohs. But I hope that a lot of the themes that they're talking about remain constant or are still relevant despite them moving jobs, because that's one of the you're always going to move jobs in those roles. And part of the reason for these, I think we have a tendency to kind of put people on a pedestal. So I don't know, at the moment, a Jurgen Klopp or someone like that,
Yeah.
we might hold, and obviously done a great job. But what you quickly realise is that they will have success and failure at the same time that Klopp has in previous roles. There will be ups and downs, and they are just people who happen to be in these positions. So I wanted to show a kind of a real kind of gritty or authentic account of leadership, not just these people are really good at what they do, they're perfect, and actually look for some areas where they differ and where they take different approaches to certain challenges and scenarios.
Interesting. And you've got 5 chapters that I'd like to work through. Making of a leader, approaches to leadership, creating a high performance culture, leading and managing others, and responding to specific leadership challenges. Um, let's begin at the beginning
Yeah.
with the making of a leader. And one thing, I mean, I loved a lot about your book, but one thing I really loved is you had these subheadings that I think sort of summed up little pockets of leadership challenges that I thought I'd read out, so the audience gets a real feel for what the book's about and what each chapter is about, and then we can have a conversation around these topics. So, chapter 1, making of a leader. These little subheadings: a strong and positive person, a family fabric, responsibility, immersion, deliberate practice and play, family presence, teachers and teaching, teaching as a personal driver, player coach transition, sense of purpose, leader to leader learning, evolving, resilience, empathy, values. Some real rich detail in this chapter. What was your learning from this?
it was interesting because those subheadings, they formed quite a conundrum to come up with, or to work out how to structure it when you've got 7 different voices.
Mm,
One big chapter title just doesn't do it
yeah.
justice. So I think as you go through the book, you'll also see that like some people are quite consistent in their contributions, and some people are really heavy in one area, and then you might not hear from them for a little bit. But I think there are so many, like there are so many areas within that. But what I really wanted to look at was, I think sometimes we're guilty of, and I see this in some of my applied work, we assume leadership is for a certain type of person.
Yeah.
And you have to have these, and I know we're going back into kind of theory, but we have to have these prerequisites. And you can talk about the different theories, but typically it's like they need to be assertive or they need to be influential. And I really wanted to dig a little bit deeper into that side of it. And I think what came out of it was there is no set of ingredients. There were some common themes, so things like resilience, and I mean that in terms of they'll have shown that in different ways throughout their careers. Some more obvious in terms of dealing with injury, or dealing with being released, or actually stuff that's a little bit deeper on a personal level, on a family level. So that was in there, but actually on a personality level, they were all quite different. So I mean, if you look now on Merseyside, like Everton and Liverpool with Klopp and Ancelotti, very, very different personalities. I don't think you need to
Yeah.
be a psychologist to see that. I mean, Carlo's book was Quiet Leadership, wasn't it? And Klopp does appear to be more extrovert and high energy in that way. So you can see different styles, and that was a really big thing for me. I think I kind of thought that anyway, but I wanted to see that a lot of these leaders, they had, if you were to do a profile on all of them, they would be different. They would, there would be a real cross section, I expect, between them. So that was a big area. And then another area for me probably was the teaching side of it. I think, a couple of the guys were teachers, or, teaching qualifications. So they've gone down that professional route. So Michael Maguire, I think taught obviously PE. I think he might have taught maths as well or something like that. And Stuart Lancaster has obviously talked about his teaching background. And as well as the people who were actually qualified teachers, there were also those who just had more of a teaching mindset. They wanted to impact people on a deeper level than just the scoreboard. And that element of teaching, I think it actually made me respect teachers more, or see the work that they do, and see how that crosses over into sport. So they were probably 2 areas that I would pick out: the personality element, the fact that these people, you can come from all walks of life and have different kind of personality traits and still be effective in that role. It's not reserved. Go on, Dan, sorry.
Do you think that a teaching background can really help you as a leader, because experiencing teaching perhaps helps you become a better communicator? You can impart the lessons that you want to impart in a more effective style.
Yeah, I think you get a lot of practice doing it, because you're getting so much time. You're doing it every day for however long that school day is, 5-6 hours. So you're getting a lot of kind of time in the field. But I think it helps you to relate to the different characters that you're working with, and probably helps you challenge yourself as well in terms of people that you might gravitate towards, or people that might be labelled as challenging, and actually trying to find a way to get the most out of those people, in order for their own development, not necessarily for a sporting result. So yeah, I think teaching I think it gives you time, but it also gives you a great background in understanding people and kind of getting that performance increased, really.
Yeah, and you also mentioned there that effective leaders possess a myriad of personality characteristics, don't
Yeah.
they? There's essentially, what you're saying in this chapter is, look, there's no right and there's no wrong,
Mm.
but you also mention the importance of resilience and empathy.
Yeah.
That in essence they're non-negotiables, and
Mm.
I'm quite passionate about personality science, and what I hear there is a leader having the capacity to manage their negative emotion, which
Yeah.
can build resilience, and a leader having some compassion, They might be tough, they might be strong, at times they might be low agreeable, but there's empathy there because they have the capacity to feel what others feel, essentially.
Yeah, definitely. I think when we make judgments on people, don't we? So Sean Dyche I suppose, is a case in point, and he even talks about it in the book. 6 foot odd skinhead, gruff voice, and the kind of perceptions that encourages. And the same with Michael Maguire. Tough Australian. You would look at him and probably think alpha male, quite introverted with things like the media, so he won't give much away. So automatically you'll think tough and you'll think aggressive. But there is always, I think, with these people, or from what I've seen with these 7, is that there is an undercurrent of empathy, of emotional intelligence, of actual genuinely caring about the people that they're working with, whether that is for a 5-year period that you might work with a player for, or whether it's a player coming in on loan. There seemed to be a real hunger to understand the individual and understand their story and where they're going, rather than just telling them what to do on a behavioural level. And this emotional intelligence or this empathy is there, but at the same time, as we all know, that there is the facts, or the undisputable facts of sport, is that there is a performance element to it as well, and a results element to it as well, in terms of they have to be getting the results in order to stay in a job. So they're constantly balancing those two approaches. But I think we see people, we assume tough, we assume aggressive, because we can't maybe see the emotional intelligence or the kind of empathy, but it is there, or it was in the people that I encountered.
When I was reading this chapter, I was considering the importance of leaders being able to flex.
Yeah.
Maybe appreciating who they are as people and the personality biases they bring to the table, but distinguishing that between their personality and their values. And maybe it's their values and their values with relation to the context that they're in that enables them to flex their personality and subsequently drive the behaviors that they need at any given time.
Yeah, I think, and that's really important, isn't it? Because when we talk about personality, sometimes people talk about it in quite you're this and I'm that, and therefore that label's going to be with you for the rest of your career. And when you move clubs, that label almost goes with you. And we can be guilty of kind of talking in that way, which is a little bit reductive at times. But being able to flex is massively important, because we do naturally gravitate towards certain people. We will enjoy, I suppose, if that's the right word, working with certain players more than others. Others might be challenging, but each player deserves that energy from the coach, or the attention, in order to build that relationship. You don't have to have that instant connection in order to still build that trust. So I think that's massively important. And then the values, I think there was a real clear sense of values across the board, across all 7. They were different values. Mm-hmm. So Dan Quinn, who's actually left his role, I think he's been fired within the NFL in the last couple of weeks, which just is another stark reminder of what sport's like. He was big on the military. He was big on things like the Navy SEALs and standards, and that kind of a deep knowledge of the military seemed to run through everything he did. Sean Dyche talked about this openness and honesty, and he talks about common sense, really, not trying to complicate things. Martinez was very much about respect. There has to be mutual respect. Gary Kirsten, actually, in terms of his values, he talks in the book about his faith, his Christian faith, and how that impacts him. And then Stuart Lancaster, and I think he'll have talked on this show about it, but very big on honesty, very big on being authentic, integrity, doing the right thing. And Ashley Giles, very, very family oriented. So it kind of, even though the values might be slightly different, I would say they all had a clear sense of what their own personal values were. And with that, and an awareness of their own personality style, there is a sense of congruence, I suppose. Not that they are perfect, but they're kind of quite clear in what they stand for and how they want to work.
As you're speaking now, it's really fascinating, because I'm thinking of how coach and or leader values can help and can hinder. As you're speaking there, the leader, Dan Quinn, whose leadership is very much built around a military theme. Probably to put it in a very simple way. I'm sure it's more complex than that. Sean Dyche, probably more sort of family oriented, people oriented, and just thinking about how those values, if I've got as a coach or leader a set of 3 to 5 values that I've written down that feel authentic to me, and I want them to shape my behavior and the behaviors in the organization around me, well, they can help, and they're going to hinder me as well, because ultimately culture isn't just about similarity, it's also about difference as well. And we've got to respect that there's going to be different viewpoints in terms of, well, I think this about the military and I love those kind of Navy SEAL behaviors. Somebody else might say, well, I'm not too sure about that. That's not for me. So one has to consider that when it comes to not only the capacity to flex our personality, but also to consider where our values help and where they hinder us.
Yeah, and I think there was a couple of interesting that came up a couple of times about how you've got to be careful as the leader not to basically project, or, well, if that person doesn't have the same values, then you're wrong and they can't play for this team or they can't be part of our group. That's where the flexibility comes in, being able to understand why that person feels that way, what they've gone through that has brought those values or those beliefs, and still being able to build that trust and that respect in order to work together. So, and Dan Quinn was, he did talk a lot about the military, but he was also really heavy on the relationship side of it. So almost a balancing act. But I think, he was kind of, I'd say he was unique in terms of my sample, in terms of talking about that military to that level. But definitely you can't then go, oh, well, my values are based on the military, and this is a player who has openly criticised the military, therefore they cannot play. There's got to be a bit more attention or energy put to that. How do we understand it? Do we understand where that's coming from, and still being able to move forward? So flexibility is massive, because otherwise you'll build a culture of people who all think the same, who all, I don't know, you're always in agreement, and A, that's unrealistic, but B, you lose a lot of the stuff that comes with people thinking in different ways and challenging each other and everything like that.
Tom, in chapter 2, you talk about approaches to leadership, and you begin by giving the reader a useful and brief introduction to the theories of leadership, trait theories, authentic leadership, transactional and transformational leadership, and social identity, and we can dwell on those for a little bit. But you then go on to talk about philosophy, consistency of approach, work-life balance, and personal development. Let's have a conversation there about approaches to leadership, and it's up to you where you'd like to start here. You certainly had there was some very interesting viewpoints on philosophy, to have a philosophy, to not have a philosophy, but please, mate, you begin where you'd like to with this chapter.
I think when I started, I just wanted to give the readers an overview of that theory, and when you're writing it, you're conscious that there's been a lot of research into these areas, and you're trying to give an overview while still trying to be thorough, which is always a challenge, because you end up writing a full chapter on it. But I think what I wanted to get across to the reader was, because it is something that I encounter, is that let's move away from this, and I think there is a move away from this, but the trait theory about the charismatic leader, or the great man theory, that we're kind of born with these skills and it's preserved for these people. So I really wanted to move away from that, but I also wanted to outline almost what the alternatives are for people, because then they could start to spot it in their own businesses or their own teams. So I just gave people an overview of kind of the main theories that I'd read about and that I'd encountered. And the big one in terms of, I suppose, is social identity, which I'm sure you've talked about that on the podcast as well, where the leader becomes almost an embodiment and an example of that group, and it's all this talk about we, not I, and really representing the values and the behaviours of the group. I think that's massively important, and I know there's the transactional and the transformational that we talked about in the middle there, but to go from the trait theory where leadership is reserved for the few, to actually it's about representing the wider values and beliefs of a group and really embodying that, then I think that that kind of shows the, not a start and finish, but an evolvement of these leadership theories to what we're talking about today.
Well, you're right. We've spoken about social identity theory as a form of team building and leadership with Dr. Matt Slater in episode 52. And we've had a few other episodes on that as well.
Yeah.
And we've spoken about transformational leadership with Jennifer Lace on episode 92. So we definitely covered some of those theories. And I completely agree. I mean, moving away from the traits, I think, is important, and is a more optimistic viewpoint of leadership, perhaps.
Yeah, I think so, and I think people that obviously the people that you know that are listening to this, some of them will have read in great detail about these theories, but some people will be listening to it as leaders of businesses, or people who are just in their jobs or as teachers, and they'll see these things that actually, if you've ever heard someone say, "Oh, I'm not really a leader," or "I'm not X enough to lead," so extrovert or talkative or confident, whatever you want to use to fill that gap. These limiting beliefs we had that almost just indicates that I still think leadership is for other people. And what I wanted to convey with this theory and also with the previous chapter is it might not be for everyone, but actually it's about finding a leadership style that fits that individual that they feel congruent with. And that's kind of really one of the messages that I wanted to come through from this, because you'll be able to think back to leaders you've had, leaders you've worked with, teachers, and they won't all have been the same, but they will all have impacted you on a deeper level. The ones that you think of, we typically think of the best and the worst, I suppose, don't we?
Absolutely. I mean, obviously, there's another approach here whereby, I mean, I spoke to Richard Nugent in episode 81, and he talked about a model devised by two researchers called Kouzes and Posner, and they identified 5 behaviors of effective leaders: model the way, inspire vision, enable others, challenge the process, and encourage the heart, which actually neatly, all 5 of those kind of neatly run through your book. But what he was saying and what you're saying and what you're outlining in this book is there's lots of different kind of personality traits that enable you to deliver on those 5 behaviors.
Definitely. And I've worked with leaders who they will almost say, "Oh, I wish I could be more," and it might be assertive. "I wish I could make kind of decisions quicker." And there is an element of there will be times when maybe they need to do that, but at the same time, the danger there is that you begin to almost wish for something that you want more, and you ignore the strengths that you've already got, and actually what makes you an effective leader or an effective individual. And the other side of it is you're always trying to educate people. It doesn't mean that if you are, I don't know, if you have a cautious decision-making style, it doesn't mean you can't make a decision. It just means it might take a little bit more energy for you to do that, or a bit more effort. And I think sometimes when I'm speaking to people, we still feel that fixed nature, even though we know it's kind of maybe not right, but with people who are in their own lived experiences, that's how they perceive it. And you're wanting people to see that actually you will have some strengths that will make you an effective leader. And leader doesn't have to be reserved for the CEO or the MD or the head coach. We can all lead in different ways, whether that's a unit, whether that's as a parent, whether that is within the team that you're working with within a business. And you don't have to have the title in order to embody some of the qualities that you've just outlined and that hopefully run through this book. Emotional intelligence or empathy and resilience being 2 of them.
That word philosophy, it seemed to inspire mixed feelings with your interviewees. I know Sean Dysham said something along the lines of it being, I could see him grimacing as you guys were talking about it, and he sort of mentioned it being potentially pseudo-intellectual. But you talk about not being put off by the term philosophy and asking yourself, well, how am I going to do this and what do I stand for? Essentially, those 2 questions might underpin what a philosophy is.
It was really interesting, and I laugh now because as soon as someone brings up the philosophy element, I think of him, and he physically kind of, I think he shook his head and kind of like adjusted his body language, almost like he was ready to kind of go in on this word. but I think you're right. It's how you kind of, it's your beliefs. It's how you see yourself doing that role, and it's what you want to evaluate. It's how you evaluate yourself afterwards as well, isn't it? And when you describe it like that, people go, "Oh yeah, that's great." I think what he kind of took exception to, or takes exception to, I think he's just trying to prove a point that actually, I think we intellectualize some of this stuff, whereas he sees it as quite common sense. And it's funny because I've written a book on it, which is again trying to intellectualize it, I suppose. But Sean Dyche's philosophy comes across as very pragmatic, very. It's about people. It's about openness. It's about communication. Stuff that he feels is quite obvious. And ironically, that is his philosophy. It's just he doesn't like the label. But when I was asking that question, it was interesting where different people went with it. So, like Roberto Martinez, I think Michael Maguire, I think they both kind of started initially talking about their on-field philosophy. So we talked kind of before this started about the technical and tactical focus that coaches might have, the bias towards that. And I think because they're used to talking in those ways, it's quite easy to go into that, how I see the game being played, which of course is one part of someone's philosophy. And then other people, so Gary Kirsten talked more about, he actually probably spoke in the most detail about his philosophy, where he was talking about it being a journey, you're not being kind of governed completely by the results, you're learning from winning and losing. And his was the most philosophical philosophy, whereas Sean Dyche still had a philosophy, but he was very much anti-philosophy in terms of the label. So it was quite a chaotic series of conversations in those elements, because some people took it on the field and some people took it away from the field. And that's probably shows us that actually it's a very personal thing, but it's something that needs exploring. And at the same time, probably not overcomplicating.
I think I'm going to start with your aside comment, I suppose, whereby you said, well, maybe this book is intellectualizing leadership, and I think that's almost being a little bit harsh on yourself, mate. I mean, I think what you're trying to do is you're trying to broaden and deepen knowledge around leadership. I think I would always see intellectualism as probably being needlessly complex with certain topics. I think
I was just going to say we had a laugh at the time because he kind of, as he was saying it, he's kind of laughing at me because I'm writing a book on it. But it's, yeah, I definitely take your point, and I hope that does come across in the book, that you're not trying to bamboozle people. You're actually just trying to project different people's accounts of these words that we do talk about a lot.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I'm going to be a raving psychologist, and maybe I'm making things more complex here, but I think what you said there about different leaders' interpretation of philosophy is fascinating. And as a psychologist, I come to this, again, probably slightly pompous word, schema. Schema theory is that, we have mental models in our mind about around what different words mean to us, what different symbols mean to us. And if we think of philosophy, our brains will go off in different directions. And I think it's fascinating that some coaches, as you say, go off onto, well, I'm thinking of playing philosophy here. I'm thinking of game models from principles of play. I'm thinking of maneuvering players around on a pitch, whereas others have gone more towards off pitch, as you kind of describe, more philosophical. It's about a journey, possibly more player centered in that respect. And one wonders if there is a sweet spot there. Maybe, bold statement here, but maybe the most dynamic leader is the one who finds that sweet spot, who's able to talk about philosophy in terms of on the pitch, on the field, but also off the pitch, off the field, where where everything meets together, essentially.
Definitely. I think it's a really good way of putting it in terms of that sweet spot. I think it was where people's initial attention went off the field. And then I think they brought it back and thought, he doesn't mean that. He wants something a bit cleverer, and that's not a slight on them. I think that's just, like you say, it's these schemas and this framework that we have, especially these people who are in that environment, focused on the game or the sport or the next match. that their natural style was to go to that, and it wasn't everyone. And I think it was just that. I think you're right. I think there is a sweet spot, because then when you get them talking about relationships, or you get them to talk about, how they judge themselves at the end of the day or something like that, or how they reflect, then you start to see other elements of their philosophy, and you realize that it is there, that it is this kind of collective, but their first instinct in some cases was to go on to the sporting side, in terms of, and Roberto Martinez is a great example, because he's very, very clear in how he wants the game to be played, in the same way that someone like probably Pep Guardiola would be. And I'm sure you could list a number of coaches who would have a really clear on-field philosophy. When you ask them to describe the off-field, it's a little bit more eclectic, I suppose, and you can see them kind of thinking as you're talking, and they're going off on different tangents. So it's something that's very hard for them to maybe feel an expectation to summarize it in like a mission statement or something like that. And I didn't really want that. I just wanted them to discuss it and see what came out. So yeah, it's a really interesting area. I mean, Sean Dyche described it, one element of it, like he described leadership as knowing what to do when you don't know what to do, which I thought was really interesting. And it was that trusting your guts, or trusting your intuition, because it's not just based on that moment in time. You're basing that decision on all your experiences you've had up to that point. So again, that's another intangible, isn't it, that people can refer to.
Perhaps it denotes the importance of experience.
Yeah, definitely. Especially when you look at younger coaches coming in who maybe don't have that, so then they might think a little bit, they might overthink a little bit more. They might find it harder to trust that instinct or the intuition.
I love the frame of reference you put down there, in terms of coaches living, or leaders living, in a bubble of, I suppose, when Saturday comes, next game, next match, especially the 7 leaders you're talking to are at the adult elite level. It is all about the next game. And coaches are so socialized into tech tack, into game models, that I wonder if, combined with the immediacy of the next game, the environment they're working in there, that their brain is oriented towards that on-field philosophy, and they don't always. And I'm not saying these leaders didn't, and I'm not saying, maybe this is something for listeners to think about, for coaches to think about. Coaches can easily orientate towards the tech tack side, and don't always link up the off-field dynamics with the on-field dynamics. They don't necessarily look at the relationships driving game plan and game model, mental skills driving game plan and game model, everything that goes on during the week from the softer side of things driving the game model. No question there, mate. Just some random thoughts.
No, and I think it's really interesting. I don't think there's a massive kind of, like, say, in terms of adding to that, but I think that their natural attention will focus on next game. We hear about the next game mentality. But sometimes, and I think we sometimes cloud it into, or chunk it up into, I need to spend 2 hours on this, 2 hours on that, 2 hours on that. And actually it's valuing those seemingly quite fleeting moments, or the little conversations you have. So sometimes that's at the end of a day, or having someone to bounce that off, and being able to realize, actually, yeah, that was a really valuable conversation, or yeah, that was really interesting what he said. What can I do about that? And it's preserving a little bit of time for that kind of reflection, rather than suddenly thinking, well, I've done that for 2 hours, so I need to do this for 2 hours. Because I think you said before, it informs everything anyway. The psychosocial stuff, it's present all the time anyway. But sometimes it just deserves a little bit more in terms of reflection and conversation, whether that's between staff, or whether that's an independent exercise that leader might do.
Chapter 3, creating a high-performance culture. You've got some subtitles there, main titles and subtitles: big picture thinking and short-term results, purpose, communicating purpose at critical points, identity, as in the badge, representing the community, legacy, sharing stories, a results business, setting the direction, goals. Interestingly, under creating a high performance culture, a lot of the psychosocial pieces in there.
Yeah, and I think what I was really fascinated. So chapter 3 and chapter 4 were one big chapter that I needed to split up, really, because it just took up so many words, basically, and it was becoming a book in itself. And I think what was fascinating, and what I was trying to do, I was trying to separate or examine all these words that we talk about that have become quite, I don't want to say buzzwords because I think that's a bit harsh, but they've become very, very popular to use. So like legacy, like purpose, standards. And I think I talk about it at the start of the chapter where we're almost looking for shortcuts to create these cultures. So there was the Japanese soccer team, I think, that tidied the changing room, which is obviously as a result of the All Blacks and everything that comes from them. And like these little things that go viral on social media, but actually underpinning that's what I really wanted to find out a little bit more about. So these terms that we talk about and we throw around a little bit, what do they actually look like? How do people differentiate between them? Or are they all actually very, very similar that we're just giving different labels to? And that's what I was trying to achieve really in this chapter. I don't think it's up for debate, really, the role of a purpose and what that provides. But in terms of the culture, I think I just wanted to question sometimes that, I mean, one leader said to me about the All Blacks that it's all very well kind of intellectualizing the All Blacks, but they've been winning games for 150 years. So, and they're very good at rugby. And this was a separate conversation. This wasn't one of the 7 guys that I spoke to. But that just made me kind of want to explore it in a little bit more detail, really.
It's interesting that you talk about the All Blacks. Look, I think there's some great stuff culturally from what they're doing that we can all learn from without a shadow of doubt. I think one has to respect that that's a culture in and of itself. And as that coach said to you, they've built it over 150 years. It's unique to them. We can perhaps borrow some qualities, some specific values from them, but one has to accept that it's what they do. The other thing to say, you mentioned that, perhaps they're just good at rugby. When I have conversations with rugby coaches, the first thing they often turn to is the athleticism, combined with the creativity, probably built from the backyard games played in that culture, in that country, in New Zealand, growing up. So I think we always have to be very careful leaders borrowing from other cultures and other leaders who are leading in other cultures.
Yeah, definitely. And it was quite a powerful statement when I had that conversation, when he was like, well, he didn't say they were just good at rugby, but he said, you've got to remember they've been winning rugby matches for 150 years. But in the same way, we know that they went through a period where they were getting to big games and not performing, and they went through this process of reflection and analysing and then putting a plan in place and executing it. But you're right, I think borrowing, and you probably see Sunday League teams do it. Let's sweep the sheds, and it's a great message, but it's what underpins that, isn't it? And what's going on when you don't see it on social media. And I'm not questioning in those examples what is going on behind closed doors, but some of this, that's where the people within the culture really have to, it's something that you've got to keep working on, isn't it? You've got to keep layering up. You've got to, I think Sean Dyche talked about the players adding detail to it. So these big picture concepts that we talk about, you can't just do the equivalent of words on a wall. There needs to be buy-in, and there needs to be an alignment between the big picture thinking of an organization or a team and the big picture thinking of the individual. So by that, I mean, what's their driver? What's their purpose? They've got to see that their purpose aligns with the organization's purpose, really, to have that buy-in, because we know in modern day sport, players have power, they have ambition. In the same way that people in business, they'll build portfolio careers. The days of people playing 15 years for one club are probably already behind us, apart from the most unique cases. So these topics, so purpose, identity, telling stories, the power of the badge, they're all massively powerful. But it's not enough just to kind of, do one intervention and then hang your hat on that. It has to be layered up. It has to be referred back to. And I think the concept of, I think you mentioned one of the subtitles there, the kind of long-term development or high performance culture together with the short-term results. I think that's a constant battle for a head coach, isn't it? Because I think there is a desire to build something bigger than just when Saturday comes, but at the same time, if they're not looking after the results, then they don't get the time to do that. And that is this constant contradiction or conflict for some of these people, because they want to do that, but in order to get that time, they also need to do this. And there were some great examples. I think Ashley Giles talked about, picking a certain player and almost saying to a young player, right, you're not going to play this week. You've done really well last week, but I'm going to play this person because actually they might not be as important to our long-term culture, but they're going to get us the best result or give us the best chance of getting a result at the weekend. Therefore, that's going to give us time, which is then going to give that player time. And it was this constant fabric almost of this big picture, but at the same time, you've got to make sure that you're at least getting a level of performance that's going to give you more time to pursue that. And that was just an ongoing conflict for some of these people, I think.
Well, you mentioned in the chapter, don't underestimate the importance of short-term interventions as long as they're underpinned by genuine and demonstrable values and behaviours.
And I think that links back to, if we talked about the social identity side, and, you can do something that's, I don't know, quite high impact, great. Like there's a lot of, there's a time and a place for that can provide a spike in energy or motivation or buy-in. But at the same time, if that then isn't backed up by standards or behaviours or the coach doing what they say they're going to do or speaking honestly with players to an extent, then those players or those people will question that, because they won't be fooled by a short-term intervention if it's not supported by what they then see on a daily basis in their interactions. They'll find you out, and that'll actually go the other way and kind of erode trust.
Well, you've mentioned there that players are powerful, and that brings us neatly onto chapter 5, leading and managing others. And you've got some really, really interesting subtitles in there that I know coaches would orientate to. People first, athlete second. All-round learning. A genuine life impact. Coach-athlete relationships. One size doesn't fit all. Taking the rough with the smooth. Relationships over strategy. Interesting one there. Respect. Time and authenticity. Relationship building moments. You've got a few others, but I've mentioned some interesting ones there. We talk about modern day players being powerful. This is such an important part of being a leader of the kind of organizations that these leaders preside over. How did they go about leading and managing others?
I think in this chapter, as you can say from some of those subtitles, really, there was just I think it's summed up by that person first, athlete second. You have to understand that individual and what drives them. You don't, and this is where it links back to that whole thing about values. You don't necessarily have to agree with everything that drives them. So you might have a player who plays for money, and the coach wants them to play for the badge, or they want some of those big picture concepts, but actually a big driver for them is financial, and that's not always for the coach to question. So really understanding what makes them tick. And I think lots of coaches, when you hear people on podcasts or in articles, they will talk about the importance of understanding individual styles, but how much do we actually do of that? How proactive are we with that? How much do we gravitate towards those players that we have a natural affinity to and we have that natural relationship with, versus those that might be labelled as more challenging or difficult or abrasive? And how do we actually go around building that same trust, although a different relationship, with those other players? So all those words that you talked about, so the person first, athlete second, one size does not fit all. Relationships over strategy, which was an interesting one. Giving people time and authenticity, all feed into this overall, I suppose, belief that it's about managing or embracing the individual differences that you've got within a group, and combining that, making that sure they're individual drivers, they can see that link to where the organization's going. And that's almost an ongoing, it's an ongoing priority, really, for these people, that always sits alongside that desire to, or the need to get a result.
Something you mentioned in the chapter, that sometimes the unsung heroes need star player attention, which
Mm,
links neatly into knowing your players, giving
mm,
them, your time is precious, isn't it? So it is reflecting on how one spends time. Who
mm,
do I spend time with? Am I giving
yeah,
everybody the right amount of time? Some players are happy just to go off and do their own thing. Others need a bit more
yeah.
attention.
Mm. And I think it's almost, if you think of that relationship as a, I don't know, a battery or a piggy bank or something that you're depositing into, like you're building up as you go. So for one player, it might be just a throwaway comment that gives them that feeling that they need, that feeling of care, that feeling of understanding, that feeling of belonging, whatever they're looking for. But another player might need a bit more in depth, like, that was really good what you did there. And they'll want to know, well, what was good? Not just blind praise, which bit of it was good? Because they'll want to analyze it. So you know that some players will want to talk about things. They'll demand more time, but you can have the same impact, or you can have a similar impact in a fleeting conversation with someone. So how do you push each player's buttons, but also knowing for the leader that it might not always be them that does that. It might be that message might come from a physiotherapist or a nutritionist or one of the assistants or the psychologist. It doesn't always have to come from the leader. And I think another thing that was common in some of these leaders was that I think there's ego in there, of course, but they would almost park that and allow that message to be delivered from someone else. And the biggest almost contrast, if you look at the NFL, where you've got 60, I think 60 players, or up to about 60, especially if you think of like practice squads, who are all physically imposing. They all come from different backgrounds. They've all kind of got their own, like we said, individual journeys and individual priorities. There's lots of ego in there. But then at the same time, you've got Dan Quinn, who again talks about military and everything like this, saying relationships make the game come to life. We're not robots. And that was something that really stuck with me, because you've got this kind of high, supposedly like tough, aggressive environment with all these physically imposing athletes, underpinned by the head coach that's saying, these are the moments that bring it alive, the conversations we have. And that was massively powerful for me, learning about a culture that I hadn't worked in, that I hadn't experienced, and seeing how they did it over there in that environment. But that really kind of brought this home, that actually relationships do underpin almost everything that you do as a leader.
You mentioned in there that leaders don't have to do it all themselves. And one thing I liked about this chapter is you talked quite a bit about being willing to delegate, being willing
Mm.
to lose a little bit of control, so that perhaps some of your people as in your staff are able to help players find solutions, establish their own relationships with players. Was that a common theme through your conversations with these leaders, that delegation is really important?
I think there was a common theme that they acknowledged that it was important. I think some struggled with it more than
Okay.
others. So Michael Maguire talked a little bit about how he wants to be across everything. That is his natural
Yeah.
tendency, and he won't typically have a huge staff in the same way that obviously Dan Quinn would have done in the NFL. And the same way actually with Quinn, he talked about, I think earlier this season or last season, he actually took on the dual role of head coach and defensive coordinator, which he'd been historically in other organizations. So almost you could see there that I need to control this. And the delegation was proving quite difficult for him on a psychological level. So he took that back. But then crucially, he realized that he couldn't do that, that it wasn't working, and then stepped away. So even though that's showing that it was difficult, he then had the humility to actually go, you know what, I was wrong. We need someone in here fully focused on this role. So I think the theme was agreed upon, that they wanted to develop their staff as well, and this theme of developing people. But there were certain leaders, Maguire being one, that found it more challenging, because when the pressure comes, he wanted to feel that he had an eye on everything. Whereas Sean Dyche was actually he talked about the fact that he lives he lives down south. He works up here in Burnley, and there's a bit of travel time. and he'll have a regular day where someone else takes training. So at the same, that what he talked about was that enables a different voice to speak to the players. It also enabled him on a selfish level, or maybe on a psychosocial level, to step back and have those, he called it horse whispering, but have those conversations that you wouldn't maybe get if you were taking training, for instance, or if you were speaking to the group. You might not be able to give that star attention to that squad player. So delegation was really important, but it was something they acknowledged, but it wasn't something that they all said, yeah, I do that and I do it really well. I think it was something that was a bit of an ongoing challenge for a few of them.
Yeah, the feeling of being in control is definitely a leadership challenge, isn't it? And I think that leads us neatly onto the last chapter, which is entitled Responding to Specific Leadership Challenges. And I love the way you've split this up, and I really recognise some of these challenges that leaders have within organisations, within modern day organisations, dealing with mavericks, disciplinary situations, unsettled players, dropping an athlete, reacting to victory and defeat, managing the media, and managing upwards to key stakeholders that sit above you in the organisation. Certainly, the dropping a player is something that those players who aren't playing, who Arsene Wenger said, I have to make X amount of players unemployed at the weekend, which is a dramatic way of putting it, but can kind of ring true to a degree. I think every one of those I can relate to,
and they've all influenced by that the psychosocial stuff, aren't they? It's all about how we then. So for instance, taking the drop in a player, like no one in. I think we have this. Oh, I can't do difficult conversations, and I'm not saying this is from a leader, but this is something I might hear from someone that I'm working with in a business or something. And you kind of say no one really likes them unless the odd person might kind of really thrive in that environment. You might be able to think of a few, but you'd be hard pressed to find someone who enjoys it. You would think, but it's being able to have those conversations with where that player, they're not going to agree with what you say probably as a leader because they're going to want to play. So they might not agree with it, but they'll at least come away going, "Well, he's spoken to me. He's outlined what I need to do." And they've outlined kind of what they're looking for. So you come away with a feeling of trust, and you come away with a feeling of respect, but not necessarily agreeing with the decision. And I think sometimes there's still that tendency to just make the decision and try and avoid that person, because leaders, they are human beings. They're not perfect, so they'll make mistakes. But I think when dropping a player, doing it honestly, timing it, being aware, having some empathy with the timing of it, making sure that they know before other people perhaps, and then outlining a solution. So what do I need to do in order to get back? And it's all governed through that relationship, isn't it? And understanding that individual. If you know that individual, you'll know that whether that player wants a load of analysis, or they want some clips, or they want some time to actually talk it through, or they want to actually be communicated in a way that might speak to their setting in the group. So we're going to need you for another game. That feeds to their responsibility. So it's a really interesting, I suppose, challenge, but it's a challenge that they have every week. And well, more than once a week, I suppose, at the moment.
Yeah, and I'm thinking there as you're speaking, I'm thinking about my experiences, and I definitely agree that honesty is the best policy. I think clear communication with no blurred lines, as you mentioned in the book, is so important, whether someone agrees with that decision or not. I think sometimes in my experience, what can be missing, and maybe this is due to time being limited, sometimes it's due to lack of resources, is the what, the how, and the why. So, as you mentioned, what the player needs to do, how they need to do it. I think sometimes the how, the strategy is missed out, and maybe sometimes the why as well. And I understand and appreciate sometimes resources, as I say, and time are limited. But I think that, in my experience, is where solution needs to accompany honesty.
Yeah, definitely. And I think as well, you've got to take into account the sporting context. So we've got people within the book, they might be in a club environment where you can talk about the next game, or we've got a game next week. Whereas if you're talking about international sport, there might not be another game, or there might not be another game for 2 months. So you're going away, and that you don't want that player. They will, if there's someone who thinks a lot and overthinks and has that tendency, then they're going to think about it. That's not really what we're trying to prevent, but we want them to be able to think about that in a rational way. So you've also got to take the context of the environment into account. And we've got Stuart in the book who talks about obviously his time with England and the time with Leinster, and the time that with England it was taken up a lot with other demands, so managing up, for instance, and you're not doing as much coaching, and you don't have that time to build the relationship to then kind of know how to drop that player or promote that young player and give them that opportunity. It takes longer to get that knowledge. So it can feel a little bit more transactional if you're not careful, I suppose, as well. And the other thing to say on that, I think it was Roberto Martinez who said, you can't always tell them everything. So there's honesty, but at the same time, there's a little bit more going on. And I don't know if I called it this in the book, like the kind of darker side of leadership, where you also need to get this performance. So you want to give them the honesty, but at the same time, sometimes you might have to hold something back, which might go against someone's values as well. So it becomes a little bit more of a grey area as well there. That was an interesting one that he outlined.
I look, on that basis, I completely agree. I think there is nuance there. We use terms, and maybe I'm fractionally contradicting myself, given a few minutes ago I talked about the importance of honesty, but there are limitations, and it comes back to characteristics helping us and hindering us. I think there's nuance to honesty. I've sat in a room where, with a group of coaches, with a head coach who's had quite strong words with a performance advisor, who's talked about the importance of honesty, and this head coach has said, "Well, I can't always be honest. There is a limitation to this, because if I'm completely honest, then I might completely destroy this player's confidence." I will change the nature of the relationship I have with the player. It will alter the work that we're doing with this player. So there is, I can't support that viewpoint enough. It's being honest to the point where it's helpful. So, I beg your pardon, it's being honest in a helpful way to the point where you don't want to go beyond that into the unhelpful, essentially.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that was the case. And another one, when you talk about a player leaving, so I think we had the example of John Stones when he was moving from Everton to Man City, and Sam Burgess when he was making the obviously well-documented journey from Australia over from rugby league to rugby union for the World Cup. And Michael Maguire talked about how when that player was moving and almost controlling the narrative he talked about, so making sure that other players saw a sense of opportunity that was going to come. And then with John Stones, he talked about that player having clarity. If this happens, this is the situation. If this happens, then this is the situation. And almost outlining a couple of options that might happen. So even though you can't, sometimes in leadership and in business and in teams, you can't be completely open and to exactly how you were saying. And almost sometimes there isn't anything else to say. Especially, I think during lockdown has been a great example, actually, when some of the best business leaders that I know or I've spoken to are the most effective. Like when there isn't any update, there's not a new process or there's not a timeline on something, but just checking in with people or just reaffirming what they've already said, just that communication. I think sometimes there's a tendency for people to go, I've got nothing new to update it, so I'll just won't say anything. And actually, just by repeating the same thing, you're keeping that communication open, which can be really important. And I think that's probably echoed a little bit in how with a player who's maybe moving clubs or something like that. I think there's some lessons to be taken there.
Interesting stuff. Tom, on the basis of nothing more to say, I mean, I think we've delved into your book quite deeply there. I mean, it's an absolutely fantastic read. There's so much information. It's one of those books that I think people, you don't have to start at the beginning. You can start at any place and you can dive in at any time. It's going to be a great resource for people. How can people get hold of it? And if you want to be found, how can people find you on social media and get in contact with you?
Yeah, so it can be found on Amazon, as which is always the place that I think people go to. But for me, actually, the big thing that I wanted to do when I set about writing this book, I wanted to see it in Waterstones in Preston, which is where I'm from, and so it's also in Waterstones, I think, or it was. So
they've all been sold, mate. They've all been sold. So
well, maybe, yeah. I mean, I've kind of been in and moved them around a little bit to try and get them at people's eye level. But that was in all seriousness, that was a big target for me to see it in there. And over that 4 years, it kind of kept me going when it wasn't easy. So Amazon, Waterstones, all of the bookshops, social media. I am Tom_Cognite, I think. I don't do a massive amount on it, but I should probably do a little bit more.
Great stuff. Tom, look, this has been awesome today. Great conversation. I can only but thank you for your time, mate. So thanks for coming on.
No, thank you very much for having me. It's been good.
Well, everyone, I really enjoyed that podcast, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, think. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Sports Psych Show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.